She was on her knees in a room she'd never seen, surrounded by men she'd never met, begging over and over, "I'm not who you're looking for," taken for reasons no one would explain. And then he walked in. The room didn't just go quiet, it went dead. He studied her face for 3 seconds. 3 seconds, and in those 3 seconds, he made a decision that neither of them could ever undo. She whispered, "I'm not who you're looking for." He said, "I know." 2 words, that's all it took. 2 words, and a door that never opened again. What happened next changed everything. The basement smelled of wet concrete and rust. Somewhere above, the muted thrum of the city continued, as if nothing had changed, as if a woman hadn't been dragged from a parking garage with a bag over her head and zip ties cutting into her wrists. Janet Wren knelt on the cold floor, her scrub still damp with the coffee she'd spilled, when the hands grabbed her. 3 men stood around her in a loose semicircle, their faces blank, their weapons holstered but visible. One of them, the tallest, with a scar that split his left eyebrow, kept checking his phone like he was waiting for a delivery. She'd stopped screaming 4 minutes ago, not because she'd given up, but because she'd realized something that terrified her more than the guns. Screaming wasn't going to change anything. These men weren't nervous, they weren't agitated, they were patient, and patient men with guns were the most dangerous kind. Her mind raced through the catalog of possibilities, on the way it always did under pressure. Wrong place, wrong time, mistaken identity, random act. But nothing about this felt random. They'd called her by a name that wasn't hers. They'd said it with certainty. Celeste. The door at the top of the stairs opened. The sound was almost gentle, a quiet click, a careful turn of the handle, but the effect was immediate. All 3 men straightened. The one with the scar put his phone away. The air in the basement shifted, condensed. It became something heavier. Footsteps descended. Slow, measured, each one deliberate, as if the person walking owned not just the stairs, but the gravity that pulled them down. Stephen Knapp appeared at the bottom of the staircase, and the room fell into a silence so complete that Janet could hear the blood moving through her own ears. He was not what she'd expected. She wasn't sure what she had expected. A hulking figure, perhaps, someone with cruelty written across his face. Instead, the man who stepped into the yellow light was lean and composed. Dark hair, cut close, eyes the color of a winter lake, gray, clear, and utterly still. He wore a black suit without a tie, the collar of his shirt open at the throat, and he moved with the kind of control that suggested every gesture had been calculated long before it was made. He was 35, though something about him seemed older, not in his body, which was clearly kept with discipline, but in his gaze. And there was an exhaustion there, not physical, but existential. The weariness of a man who had seen too many people lie to him and had stopped being surprised by it. He looked at her, not at the situation, not at his men. At her, and in that look, Janet felt something she couldn't name. A kind of attention that went past her face and into the architecture of who she was. He studied the way her hands trembled, but her jaw stayed set. He noted the scrubs, pale blue, its standard issue, and the ID badge clipped to her pocket, the one they hadn't bothered to take. He saw the small scar on her forearm, the kind a kitchen burn leaves, and the calluses on her palms that spoke of manual labor, not privilege. He knew. In that first 3 seconds before she opened her mouth, before she said a word, Stephen Knapp knew that the woman kneeling on his floor was not Celeste Marchetti. Celeste Marchetti had soft hands and a face sculpted by surgeons. And Celeste Marchetti wore silk and perfume that cost more than this woman probably earned in a month. Celeste Marchetti would have been sobbing, bargaining, offering her father's name like a shield. This woman was none of those things. "I'm not who you're looking for," she whispered. Her voice was steady, cracked but steady, like a bone that had broken and healed stronger. One of his men, Victor, the one with the scar, shifted. "She matches the description. Dark hair, early 20s, Leaving the clinic on Halstead at— I heard you, Stephen said. His voice was low, unhurried, the kind of voice that didn't need volume to command a room. He hadn't looked away from her. She met his eyes. That was the thing that held him. The thing that changed the calculus entirely. She met his eyes and did not look away. My name is Janet Wren, she said. I'm a nurse. I work nights at the free clinic on Halstead Street. I was walking to my car after a double shift. I am not whoever you think I am. Silence. Victor glanced at Stephen. The other two men waited. Stephen reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. He tapped the screen twice, then turned it so she could see the photograph. A woman with dark hair and sharp cheekbones, wearing a red dress, caught mid-laugh at some gala. Celeste Marchetti. Janet looked at the photo. Looked at herself. The resemblance was there. The same dark hair, similar bone structure. In close enough in a parking garage at 1 a.m. under bad lighting. I see it, she said quietly. But that's not me. I know, Stephen said. The room went still in a different way. Victor's hand moved to his holster, not drawing, but ready. The other men exchanged a glance. Sir, Victor began. She stays. 2 words, no explanation, no negotiation. Janet's blood turned to ice. I just told you I'm not— I heard what you said. Stephen pocketed his phone and took a single step closer, not threatening, not gentle, something in between that was worse than both. And I believe you, but that doesn't change your situation, Miss Wren. If anything, it makes it more complicated. More complicated? A thread of anger pushed through the fear. You kidnapped the wrong person. Let me go. If I let you go right now, you'll be dead by morning. The way he said it, flatly, without drama, the way a doctor might deliver a terminal diagnosis, made her believe him immediately. Enzo Marchetti's men are looking for his daughter, Stephen continued. Not to rescue her, to silence her. She has information that could dismantle 3 of his operations, and she's been selling it to the highest bidder. My people picked you up because they thought you were her. If Marchetti's people make the same mistake— He let the sentence die. He didn't need to finish it. Don't then tell them, Janet said, her voice rising. Tell them I'm not her. You think they'll ask first? His eyes were steady, unblinking. They don't check IDs, Miss Wren. They don't ask questions. They put a bullet through the problem and move on. The basement felt smaller. The walls pressed in. Janet could feel the cold of the concrete through the thin fabric of her scrubs, and for the first time since they'd grabbed her, she felt something worse than fear. She felt the slow and sickening realization that he might be right. So your solution, she said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, is to keep me here. My solution is to keep you alive. That's not the same thing. Something shifted in his expression, a crack so fine it might have been imagined. A flicker of something that could have been respect or surprise or both. No, he agreed. It's not. He turned to Victor. Put her in the east wing, the room with the balcony. Outpost Joseph and Marcus outside. He paused. She's not a prisoner. Then what is she? Victor asked, his tone carefully neutral. Stephen didn't answer immediately. He looked at Janet one more time, really looked, the way someone reads the last page of a letter before deciding whether to burn it. She's under my protection, he said, whether she wants it or not. He climbed the stairs without looking back. The door closed behind him with the same gentle click that had announced his arrival. And Janet was left kneeling on the cold concrete, surrounded by armed men, with the echo of 2 truths ringing in her head. She was not who they were looking for, and he was going to keep her anyway. The room with the balcony was beautiful. That was the cruelest part. It was on the 3rd floor of a brownstone in Lincoln Park, the kind of building that looked like old money from the outside and turned out to be fortress-level security on the inside. The room itself had hardwood floors, a king-sized bed with linen sheets, a private bathroom with a clawfoot tub, and French doors that opened onto a narrow balcony overlooking a garden she wasn't allowed to enter. Janet sat on the edge of the bed, still in her scrubs, and stared at the ceiling. It was 3:47 in the morning. Her shift at the clinic had ended at midnight. By now, if everything had gone normally, she would have been asleep in her studio apartment on the south side, the radiator clanking, and the traffic noise fading into white noise. She would have set her alarm for 10, made herself eat something before bed, and fallen asleep, reading whatever she'd checked out from the library that week. Instead, she was in a dead man's house, or at least a man who made dead men, and she had no phone, no wallet, and no idea how long this was going to last. She didn't cry. She wanted to. The pressure built behind her eyes like a weather system, heavy and insistent. But she had learned a long time ago that tears were a luxury she couldn't afford. You cry when you're safe. And she had never, not once in her 21 years, been truly safe. The foster system had taught her that. 6 homes in 14 years. Some of them good enough, warm beds, regular meals, adults who meant well but were stretched too thin. Some of them bad. One of them terrible. And she'd survived all of it by developing a skill that served her now. The ability to assess a situation clearly, without panic, and figure out what she could control. Right now, she could control very little. But she could think. She replayed the conversation in the basement. The man, Stephen Knapp, she'd heard one of the guards murmur the name on the walk upstairs, had believed her. That was the part she kept returning to. He hadn't tortured her, hadn't threatened her, and he'd looked at her with those gray, glass-still eyes and simply known, which meant he was intelligent, observant, capable of changing course when the facts demanded it. In her experience, those were rare qualities in powerful men. Most of them clung to their assumptions like life rafts, too proud to admit they'd been wrong. He'd been wrong about who she was. He'd admitted it without hesitation, but he hadn't let her go. A knock on the door, soft, perfunctory, and then it opened. A woman in her 50s entered carrying a tray, a glass of water, a sandwich wrapped in wax paper, a small bottle of aspirin. She had silver hair pulled back in a clip, and the kind of face that had once been beautiful and was now something better. Kind. "I'm Margaret," she said, setting the tray on the nightstand. "I run the house." She looked at Janet's scrubs, at the red marks on her wrists where the zip ties had been. "I'll bring you clean clothes in the morning. There are towels in the bathroom. Is there anything else you need?" Janet stared at her. "A phone. My freedom. An explanation that makes any of this make sense." Margaret's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close. "I'll see what I can do about the third one." She moved toward the door, then paused. "For what it's worth, miss, you're not in danger here. Whatever you may think of Mr. Knapp, he doesn't harm women. That's not who he is. He's keeping me against my will." "He's keeping you alive," Margaret said, and something in her voice, something sad and certain, made Janet wonder what this woman had seen. What she'd survived in this house. The door closed. The lock didn't click. Janet noticed that. The door wasn't locked. She could walk out, down the hall, down the stairs, out the front door. And then what? Into a city where someone was hunting a woman who looked exactly like her. She ate the sandwich. She took 2 aspirin. She lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, and waited for morning. Sleep didn't come, but morning did. The first 3 days blurred together in a haze of quiet rage and careful observation. Janet learned the geography of the house the way she'd once learned the layout of each new foster home, quickly, methodically, noting exits and blind spots and the rhythms of the people who moved through it. The brownstone was deceptively large, in 3 stories above ground, at least 1 below. The main floor held a kitchen, a formal dining room that was never used, a sitting room with bookshelves that covered every wall, and Stephen's office, the one room she was explicitly told not to enter. The second floor was Victor's domain, a command center of sorts, with security monitors and communication equipment, and a door that was always closed. The third floor was bedrooms, hers, Margaret's, and several others that seemed permanently empty. She saw Stephen twice in those 3 days, once passing in the hallway. He was on the phone, speaking in a language she didn't recognize, and he acknowledged her with a nod so brief it could have been a muscle spasm. The second time she found him in the kitchen at 2 in the morning, sitting at the island counter with a glass of something dark, reading a hardcover book with no dust jacket. He'd looked up, she'd frozen in the doorway. "Dejan, the tea is in the cabinet above the stove," he said, and went back to reading. She'd made tea. Chamomile. She'd stood at the counter with her back to him, hyper-aware of his presence the way you're aware of a still body of water that might be deeper than it looks. Neither of them spoke. After 10 minutes, she'd taken her tea upstairs. The next morning she found a library card on her nightstand. Her library card, the one from her wallet, which she hadn't seen since the night they took her. Beneath it was a note in handwriting that was precise and unadorned. "Margaret can take you to the library on Tuesdays and Fridays. You'll be accompanied, but not confined. D." Janet held the card for a long time. It was such a small thing, a rectangle of laminated paper, a number, her name, but it was also the first indication that Stephen Knapp had paid attention, not to her as a captive, but to her as a person. He'd noticed the book on her nightstand, and he'd checked her wallet and found the library card and understood what it meant to her. It made her furious, because kindness from a captor was the most dangerous thing of all. On the 5th day, Janet lost her temper. It happened in the sitting room, the one with all the books. She had been pacing, 4 walls, 12 steps each way, and the sheer absurdity of it had finally cracked something inside her. She was a nurse. She had patients, Mrs. Delgado, who came in every Thursday for her insulin adjustment and always brought homemade empanadas for the staff. Jalen, 17, who was trying to get clean and trusted Janet more than he trusted any of the counselors. The clinic was understaffed, underfunded, and she was one of 3 night shift nurses who actually showed up consistently. They needed her, and she was here, in a mansion that smelled like cedar and old leather, being protected by a man who wouldn't even look at her long enough to have a conversation. She found him in his office. She didn't knock. Stephen was standing at his desk, his jacket off, his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow. He was looking at a set of photographs spread across the dark wood, surveillance photos from the angle and grain of them. Victor was beside him, pointing at something in one of the images. Both men looked up when she entered. Victor's hand moved toward his waist. Stephen's didn't. "You can't keep me here," Janet said. Victor stepped forward. "You were told." "Victor." One word from Stephen, and the larger man stopped. "Give us the room." Victor hesitated, a half-second of visible reluctance, then gathered the photographs, straightened them into a neat stack, and left. He closed the door behind him, but Janet had no doubt he was standing directly on the other side. Stephen looked at her. That same look, the one from the basement, the one that went past the surface and into something deeper. "Sit down, Miss Wren." "I don't want to sit down. I want to leave." "I understand that." "Then let me go." "I can't do that." "You mean you won't?" "I mean I can't." He leaned against the edge of his desk and folded his arms. It was a careful gesture, not aggressive, but grounding, as if he needed to anchor himself before saying what came next. 3 days ago, Enzo Marchetti's men found a woman matching his daughter's description in Milwaukee. A waitress, 23. They questioned her for 6 hours before they determined she wasn't Celeste. He paused. She didn't survive the questioning. The room went very quiet. Her name was Sophie Reed, Stephen said. She had a 2-year-old son. Janet felt the floor tilt. The anger was still there. It hadn't gone anywhere, but now it had company. A cold, spreading dread that seeped into the spaces between her ribs. "You look like Celeste Marchetti," Stephen continued, his voice even, clinical almost, the way Janet herself delivered bad news to patients. "Same height, same build, same hair color. If my men made the mistake, Marchetti's will too. And they won't sit you down in a nice room and bring you sandwiches. So I'm supposed to just, what, live here, indefinitely? Until Marchetti finds his daughter." Or until I find her first. And how long will that take? I don't know. The honesty of it, the raw, unpolished truth of I don't know, hit her harder than any lie would have. A liar would have given her a timeline. A manipulator would have made promises. Stephen Knapp just stood there and let the uncertainty sit between them like a living thing. I have a life, Janet said, and her voice broke on the last word. Not in the way of someone falling apart, but in the way of someone holding something heavy that they can't put down. I have patients who depend on me. I have rent due in 9 days. I have a world out there that is small and unglamorous and completely mine, and you have no right to take it from me. Stephen was quiet for a long time. Long enough that Janet thought he might not respond at all. Then he said, "Your rent has been paid. Your supervisor at the clinic has been told you have a family emergency, and your apartment is being watched to make sure no one goes through it." She blinked. "That's not..." She shook her head. "That's not the point." "I know it's not." "Then why did you do it?" He looked at her, the way someone looks at a wound they didn't cause but feel responsible for anyway. "Because you shouldn't lose everything just because you walked to your car at the wrong time." Janet stood there in his office, in the warm light of a desk lamp that probably cost more than her monthly salary, and she felt something crack in the wall she'd built between them. Not fall, just crack. "I want my phone," she said. "It's being monitored. If Marchetti's people..." "I don't care. I want to call my patients. I want to call Mrs. Delgado and tell her to get her son to take her to her Thursday appointment because the insulin adjustment is critical. And her A1C was 11.2 last week. And if someone doesn't..." "Give me the information," Stephen said. "I'll make sure it gets handled." "You'll..." She stopped, stared at him. "You're a crime lord. You're going to manage my patient's insulin schedule?" For the first time, something shifted in his expression. Oh, not a smile. Stephen Knapp didn't seem like a man who smiled, but a subtle loosening of the tension around his mouth, something almost warm. "I'm going to make sure the people you care about are taken care of," he said. "That's not a negotiation, Miss Wren. That's a fact." She gave him Mrs. Delgado's information, then Jalen's counselor. Then the contact for the clinic's scheduling coordinator. He wrote it all down, by hand, on a legal pad, in that same precise handwriting. And she watched him do it. This man who moved hundreds of millions of dollars through invisible channels, who had people killed with a phone call, carefully noting the phone number of a 70-year-old diabetic woman who made empanadas. Something dangerous happened in that moment. Janet began to see him. The days took on a rhythm. Mornings, Janet read. The sitting room library was extraordinary, not curated for show, but genuinely, eclectically loved. The first editions of Dostoevsky sat beside dog-eared paperbacks of Le Carré. There were medical textbooks, philosophy, poetry collections in 3 languages, and a shelf of hard-boiled detective fiction that seemed almost sentimental. She pulled out a volume of Raymond Chandler one afternoon and found a dedication written on the inside cover. "To Stephen, who understands that the world is dark, but you don't have to be. Happy 18th birthday." "Mom." She put the book back carefully. It did as if she'd touched something that wasn't meant for her. For afternoons, she walked the garden. It was larger than it appeared from her balcony, walled on all sides, invisible from the street, with a flagstone path that wound through beds of lavender and white roses and a single magnolia tree that must have been there since before the house was built. She was always accompanied, Marcus, usually, a quiet man in his 40s who had the build of someone who'd spent serious time in a boxing gym and the demeanor of someone who preferred libraries. They didn't talk much, but Marcus had a habit of pointing out birds. "That's a cedar waxwing," he'd say, nodding toward a branch. Or, "red-tailed hawk. See the belly band?" It was such an incongruous thing, a bodyguard who knew ornithology, that Janet found herself looking forward to their walks. Evenings were the hardest. The house settled into a different frequency after dark. The security shifts changed. The hallway lights dimmed to a low amber, and the silence became the kind that made you aware of your own breathing. Janet would lie in bed and think about the clinic, about her apartment, about the thousand small freedoms she'd taken for granted. Choosing what to eat for dinner, walking to the corner store, sitting on her fire escape, and watching the city blink. And she would think about him. And she couldn't help it. Stephen Knapp was everywhere and nowhere in that house. His presence lingered in the books, in the garden he clearly maintained himself. She'd seen the dirt under his fingernails one morning, quickly hidden, in the coffee that appeared freshly brewed every day at precisely 6 a.m., regardless of whether anyone was awake to drink it. But the man himself remained a ghost. He moved through rooms without sound, appeared and disappeared without pattern, and spoke to her in brief, the measured exchanges that gave nothing away. Until the night of the thunderstorm. It came suddenly, a June storm that turned the sky green and shook the windows. Janet had been in the sitting room, curled in the armchair by the cold fireplace, when the power went out. The house plunged into darkness. Emergency lights kicked on along the baseboards, casting the hallways in a pale, clinical glow. She heard footsteps, voices on the security channel. Then Stephen's voice, calm and commanding, in issuing orders she couldn't quite make out. She should have gone to her room. Instead, she went to the kitchen. He was already there, standing by the window, watching the lightning crack open the sky, holding a glass of water. Just water. He turned when she entered, and for once she saw him without his armor, without the suit, without the calculated composure. He was wearing a gray t-shirt and dark pants, and in the blue-white flash of the lightning, he looked younger, tired, human. Storm knocked out the grid for 6 blocks, he said. Generators running, but I told them to keep it on low power. Why? Because sometimes it's good to sit in the dark. It was such a strange thing to say, such an honest, unguarded thing. Janet stood in the doorway and felt the storm pressing against the walls and thought, this is who he is when nobody's watching. She sat at the kitchen table. After a moment, he sat across from her. They listened to the rain. How did you end up running? She gestured vaguely. All of this? You mean the criminal empire? His tone was dry, almost amused. I was trying to be diplomatic. Don't. I prefer directness. She watched him in the emergency lighting, his face half in shadow, his eyes catching the pale glow like water catching the moon. Then how did you end up running a criminal empire? He was quiet for a while. The rain hammered against the glass. Lightning turned the kitchen white, then dark, and then white again. My father built it, he said. He was a different kind of man. Brutal, indiscriminate. He believed in power for its own sake. He turned the glass in his hands slowly, watching the water catch the light. He died when I was 22. Heart attack, and I had a choice. Let it all collapse and watch the violence that would come from the power vacuum, or take it and try to make it less brutal, less indiscriminate. He looked at her. I won't pretend to be a good man, Miss Wren. I've made decisions that would horrify you, but I've also stopped things that would have happened without me. There's a calculus to it, a terrible, necessary calculus, and I accepted a long time ago that I would carry the weight of it. That sounds lonely, she said before she could stop herself. The look he gave her was so unguarded, it almost hurt to see, like she'd pressed a thumb into a bruise he'd forgotten was there. It is, he said. The rain eased, the lights flickered, then came back on. The moment dissolved, replaced by the ordinary brightness of a kitchen at night. Stephen stood. Good night, Miss Wren. Janet, she said. My name is Janet. He paused at the doorway. Didn't look back. Good night, Janet. After he left, she sat at the table for a long time, listening to the last of the storm move east, and tried to understand why her chest felt tight in a way that had nothing to do with fear. And something changed after the storm. The shift was small, invisible to anyone who wasn't paying attention, but Janet was paying attention. She was always paying attention. It was the thing that had kept her alive in foster homes, in underfunded schools, in the chaotic emergency rooms of her clinical rotations. Stephen began to be present. Not constantly, not obviously, But where before he had been a shadow in the halls, a voice behind closed doors, he began to materialize in shared spaces. And he appeared in the sitting room while she was reading, settling into the leather chair by the window with his own book. He ate breakfast at the kitchen island while she drank her tea, both of them in comfortable silence. He walked through the garden while she was there, not approaching, but not avoiding her either. They existed in parallel, and slowly, so slowly she almost didn't notice it happening, the parallel lines began to converge. It started with books, and he'd leave one on the table with a note tucked inside. Not a recommendation exactly, but a challenge. You mentioned you hadn't read Middlemarch. This is a good addition. Or, this collection of case studies on emergency medicine is from 2023. Your textbook was from 2019. She responded in kind. She found a volume of Mary Oliver on his shelf and left it open on his desk to a poem about attention and devotion, not as a romantic gesture, but as an argument, a way of saying, I see who you are, and it's more complicated than you think, and he didn't mention it. But the next day, the poem was bookmarked with a pressed magnolia petal from the garden. It was Janet who broke the pattern of silence first. 10 days into her captivity, her protection, his word, her imprisonment, hers, she found him in his office late at night, not working but staring at the wall with the kind of blankness that she recognized. She saw it in the mirror sometimes, and the look of someone replaying a conversation that couldn't be unspoken, a decision that couldn't be undone. Who did you lose? She asked from the doorway. He didn't startle. He never startled. But his jaw tightened, and when he looked at her, there was something raw in his expression that he didn't bother to hide. My brother, he said. Luca. When? He's not dead. A pause, heavy, loaded. He betrayed me. 14 months ago. He fed information to the Marchetti family in exchange for a guarantee of safety if they took power. His voice was even, too even, the way a surface is smooth when it's frozen. I had to cut him out of everything. The business, the family, the house. He's somewhere in Europe now. I don't look for him. But you think about him. Every day. Janet stepped into the office. She sat in the chair across from his desk, the one Victor usually occupied, and folded her hands in her lap. I had a foster brother once, she said. Terrence. He was 2 years older. The only person in any of my placements who ever really looked out for me. He taught me how to ride a bike, how to fight, how to make scrambled eggs without burning them. When he aged out of the system, he promised he'd come back for me. She paused. He didn't. I was 13. Stephen watched her with those gray eyes. I was angry for years, she said. Angry that he'd left, angry that he'd promised. Yeah, angry that I'd believed him. But eventually I understood something. He was drowning too. He couldn't save me because he couldn't save himself. And the promise wasn't a lie. It was a wish. You're remarkably generous, Stephen said. I'm not sure your brother deserved it. Maybe not. But I deserved to stop being angry. Something crossed his face, a ripple in the still water. He opened his mouth, closed it, and then said something she didn't expect. Thank you. For what? For not telling me what I should feel about Luca. Everyone has an opinion. You're the first person who's just told me a story. She stood up, smoothed the front of the borrowed clothes she'd been wearing. Margaret's, slightly too large, impossibly comfortable. That's what humans do, Mr. Knapp. We sit in rooms and tell each other stories and hope that something in them is useful. She walked to the door, stopped, turned back. Stephen, she said. If I'm calling you by your name, you should know that I haven't forgiven you for keeping me here. I understand the reasons. But understanding isn't the same as acceptance. I know, he said. Good, she said. As long as we're clear. She left. Behind her, in the empty office, Stephen Knapp sat very still and noticed something he hadn't felt in years. A pull, not desire, not yet, not so simply, but something adjacent to it. A gravitational shift. And the awareness that someone had entered his orbit who could not be categorized, predicted, or controlled. It terrified him. He led it. On the 14th day, Janet saved a life. It happened early, just past 6 in the morning. She was in the kitchen making tea when she heard a crash from the second floor, followed by a sound that her training identified before her conscious mind did. The wet, gasping struggle of someone who couldn't breathe. She ran, in the hallway, till she found one of the security team, a young man named Tomas, barely older than she was, on the floor, his face turning the dusky blue-gray of oxygen deprivation. His hands were at his throat. His eyes were wide with the particular terror that comes from a body fighting itself. Anaphylaxis. She recognized it instantly. "Does anyone have an EpiPen?" She shouted down the hall. No response. Marcus appeared at the top of the stairs, frozen. Victor came around the corner, hand on his weapon, useless against this enemy. Boom. Janet dropped to her knees beside Tomas. She checked his airway, swelling, severe, and pressed 2 fingers to his carotid. Pulse rapid, thready. He had minutes, maybe less. "His room," she said to Victor. "Now, check his drawer, his bag, his pockets. Anything labeled epinephrine. Go." Victor didn't hesitate. He moved. Janet tilted Tomas's head back, cleared his airway as best she could, and began talking to him in the same voice she used in the ER. Steady, warm, commanding. "You're going to be okay. Look at me. Don't close your eyes. I'm right here." Stephen appeared. She didn't know where he'd come from. One moment the hallway held only her and the dying man, and the next, Stephen was there, crouching beside her. "What do you need?" he asked. No panic, no questions about what was happening, just, "What do you need?" "Epinephrine. If there's no EpiPen, I need a syringe and a vial. Do you have a medical kit?" "Downstairs." "I'll get it." He was gone and back in under a minute. A tactical medical kit, the kind that went beyond first aid. Janet tore it open, found the epinephrine, drew the dose with hands that were steady as stone, and administered the injection in Tomas's thigh. Then she waited. 20 seconds. 30. An eternity. Tomas drew a ragged, shuddering breath. Then another. His color began to shift. From gray to white to something approaching living. "There you are," Janet murmured. "There you are. Keep breathing." Victor returned with an EpiPen. Too late, but she took it anyway. Kept it close in case a second dose was needed. For the next hour, Janet stayed on the floor beside Tomas, monitoring his breathing, his pulse, the swelling. She sent Marcus for ice, directed Margaret to prepare a bed on the ground floor, and, when Tomas was stable enough to move, supervised the careful transfer with the efficiency of someone who had done this 100 times. Because she had. Me and Stephen watched all of it. He stood in the hallway and watched this woman who had every reason to let his people fend for themselves, who owed nothing to the men who had taken her from her life, save one of them, without a moment's hesitation. Later, when Tomas was sleeping and the house had settled into an uneasy calm, Stephen found Janet in the garden. She was sitting on the stone bench beneath the magnolia tree. To her borrowed shirt spotted with the iodine she'd used to clean the injection site, her hands finally trembling. She always trembled after, never during. He sat beside her, not close enough to touch, close enough that she could feel his warmth in the cool morning air. "Thank you," he said. "Tomas has a 4-year-old daughter." Janet nodded. She didn't trust her voice. They sat in silence. A cardinal landed on the garden wall, its red so vivid it looked artificial. "Hey, this is what you do," Stephen said quietly. "Not a question. It's who I am." "Yes," he said. "I'm beginning to understand that." She looked at him, really looked at him, the way she hadn't let herself before. In the morning light, without the armor of his suit, without the controlled distance he wore like cologne, he was just a man sitting in a garden, grateful that someone he cared about was alive. He cared about Tomas. He cared about his people. She could see it now. In the fine lines around his eyes, in the way his hands were clasped together so tightly the knuckles had gone white. He'd been afraid. Genuinely, deeply afraid. And he was sitting here, in the aftermath, trying to hold himself together the same way she was. "Okay, you should know," Janet said. That this doesn't change anything between us. I wouldn't expect it to. Good. Because I'm still furious. I know. And I still want to go home. I know that too. She looked at the cardinal. He watched it hop along the wall, cocking its head, oblivious to the complicated lives of the humans below. But I'm glad Tomas is alive, she said. So am I. She stood up, brushed the garden dirt from her borrowed pants. Walked 3 steps toward the house, then stopped. Stephen. Yes? Next time, keep EpiPens on every floor and make sure your team's medical histories are on file. Tomas has a tree nut allergy that nobody told me about. In a proper house, and that information is known. He looked at her, and for the first time, the very first time, Stephen Knapp smiled. It was small, brief, a crack in the glacier. But it changed his entire face, warmed it, made him look like someone she could imagine laughing. Yes, ma'am, he said. She went inside. Behind her, the smile lingered, then faded, then settled into something deeper, something that lived in the chest, not the mouth, and would not be easily removed. 3 weeks in, and Janet had become a fixture. She didn't notice it happening. Neither did anyone else, exactly. But there was a shift in the household, subtle, like a change in air pressure before weather. Margaret started asking her opinion on meals. Marcus saved articles about migratory birds on his phone to show her during their garden walks. Even Victor, who regarded her with the steady suspicion of a man paid to suspect everyone, had started nodding at her in the mornings. It wasn't warmth, but it was acknowledgement. From Victor, that was practically an embrace. And Stephen, who had built his life on distance and discipline, found himself orbiting closer and closer to the quiet gravity of a woman who had no power, no leverage, no reason to stay, and who was, despite everything, becoming essential. He noticed things. That was the problem. And he'd always been an observer. It was the skill that had kept him alive in a world where missing a detail could mean a knife in the dark. But his observation of Janet had become something else. Something less tactical, more devotional. He noticed that she hummed when she read. Low, tuneless, like a radio caught between stations. He noticed that she braided her hair when she was thinking, her fingers moving automatically, the way his moved when he disassembled a firearm. And he noticed that she ate slowly, deliberately, as if every meal was a gift she'd learned not to take for granted. And he noticed, with a clarity that felt like a blade between his ribs, that she was beautiful. Not in the way he'd been taught to notice beauty, all artifice and performance, but beautiful the way a storm is beautiful, or a coastline, or the first light of morning through a hospital window. Beautiful because she was entirely, irreducibly herself. He did nothing about it. Yet he couldn't. She was under his protection, which meant she was not, could not, would not be his. The power imbalance was absolute. She was in his house, under his roof, surrounded by his people. Any advance, any gesture beyond the strictly necessary would be an abuse of that power. And Stephen Knapp had spent 13 years trying to be a different kind of man than his father, so he kept his distance. He was careful, he was controlled, and every night, alone in the dark of his bedroom, he thought about the way she'd looked at him in the garden, and he felt something he hadn't felt in years, the ache of wanting what you've decided you can't have. Janet, for her part, was fighting a parallel war. She knew what was happening to her. She'd studied enough psychology, seen enough of human nature in hospital rooms and emergency departments to recognize the patterns. Proximity, shared crisis, the slow accretion of intimacy through daily rhythms and accidental vulnerabilities. Stockholm Syndrome was too simple a label, too neat, too dismissive, but the underlying mechanism was there. When you depend on someone for safety, your mind begins to reshape them into something worth depending on. Except that Stephen wasn't being reshaped. He was being revealed. She saw the calls he made late at night. Not about business, but about people. Checking on Tomas's daughter, making sure a witness in an unrelated case had safe housing. approving funds for a community center in a neighborhood his father's operations had devastated. She saw the books he dog-eared, the passages he underlined, always about duty, sacrifice, the cost of power. She saw the way he spoke to Margaret, with a deference that went beyond employer and employee, a tenderness that suggested she had known him when he was small and unformed, and that he trusted her memory of that version of himself. She saw the scar on his left shoulder, glimpsed once, even when he'd rolled his sleeves too high, and the way he'd pulled the fabric down quickly when he noticed her looking. She didn't ask about it. She didn't need to. Scars told their own stories, and she had enough of her own to know that some of them were not for sharing. What frightened her was not that she was softening toward him. What frightened her was that the softening felt honest, not like a survival mechanism, not like gratitude misfiring as affection. It felt like seeing. In and being seen, Antwe. On the 21st day, they had their first real conversation, not about the situation, not about safety or logistics or the world outside, a real conversation, the kind that peels back layers without either person noticing until it's too late. It happened on the balcony off the sitting room, at twilight. The city was turning on its lights below them, a galaxy of windows and street lamps and brake lights. And the air smelled of rain and cut grass. Why nursing? Stephen asked. He was leaning against the railing, his face in profile, the dying light catching the angle of his jaw. Because I spent a lot of time in hospitals as a kid, Janet said. Foster system, various injuries, some mine, some other kids. The nurses were always the ones who saw us. They, not the doctors. They came in, did their thing, left. The nurses stayed. They knew your name. They remembered which flavor of Jell-O you liked. She paused. What? I wanted to be the person who stayed. You wanted to be the person no one was for you. The precision of it stunned her. She looked at him and he looked back, and for a moment, the city below them didn't exist. The danger didn't exist. The bars of this beautiful cage dissolved into nothing. Yes, she said. That's not weakness, Stephen said. That's the bravest thing I've ever heard. Janet felt the heat rise to her face and was grateful for the dim light. Oh, don't do that. Do what? See me that clearly. It's disorienting. I could say the same to you. The air between them was charged, not with the electricity of physical attraction, though that was there too, but with something more dangerous, recognition. The terrible intimacy of two people who had learned to survive alone, discovering that someone else speaks their language. Neither of them moved closer, neither of them moved away. I should go inside, Janet said. Yes, Stephen said. You should. She didn't move. Janet. Yes? I need you to know something. He turned to face her fully, and his expression was open in a way she'd never seen, unguarded, almost vulnerable. When this is over, when you're free to leave, I will not ask you to stay. I will not guilt you, manipulate you, or make it difficult. You will walk out of that door and back into your life, and I will make sure no one touches you ever again. That is my promise. Why are you telling me this now? Because I'm afraid that if I wait much longer, I won't be able to mean it. The honesty of it, the raw, crystalline honesty, hit her like cold water. She understood exactly what he was saying. He was drawing a line. Not between them, but around himself. A boundary that said, I feel what I feel, but I will not let it compromise your freedom. Thank you, she said. She meant it. She went inside. She didn't sleep that night, and neither did he. The attack came on the 26th day. Later, when the forensic team went through the evidence and the security footage and the communication logs, they would determine that it had been Luca. Stephen's brother, the exile, the betrayer. Luca, who had sold Stephen's secrets to the Marchetti family, and then, when that wasn't enough, had sold them something more dangerous, the location and layout of the Lincoln Park brownstone. But Janet didn't know any of that when the windows shattered. It was 3 a.m. She'd been asleep, finally, deeply, when the world split open. The sound of breaking glass, multiple points simultaneously, The kind of coordinated breach that spoke of planning and patience. Then gunfire, not the slow, deliberate kind she'd heard in movies, but rapid, overlapping, a chaos of percussion that made her teeth vibrate. She rolled off the bed and onto the floor, pulling the mattress half over her, a reflex drilled into her during the years of living in neighborhoods where gunshots were as common as car alarms. Her hands found the emergency flashlight Margaret had given her on her first night. She clicked it on. The beam cut through the dust-filled dark. The house was under siege. She heard Victor's voice through the walls, clipped, commanding, directing the security team with the precision of someone who'd done this before. She heard the deeper percussion of return fire. She heard distantly the wail of a car alarm on the street below, and then she heard footsteps in the hallway outside her door. Not the heavy, purposeful tread of Stephen's men. Something lighter, faster, predatory. The door handle turned. Janet's hand closed around the brass lamp on the nightstand. It was heavy, solid brass, probably an antique, and she gripped it like a weapon because that's what it now was. The door opened. A man she'd never seen stepped through. He was compact, wiry, wearing tactical gear and a balaclava, and he had a gun in his right hand and a phone in his left. He swept the room with the gun, found her crouched beside the bed, and said 2 words into the phone. Found her. He thought she was Celeste. He moved toward her. Janet threw the lamp. It wasn't a graceful throw. There was nothing cinematic about it, but it was accurate. The base of the lamp caught him in the forearm, and hard enough to knock the gun sideways. He swore, stumbled, and in the half-second it took him to recover, Janet was on her feet and moving. Not toward the door, he was blocking it, toward the balcony. She hit the French doors at a run, burst through them into the cold night air, and looked down. 3 stories. The garden below. The flagstone path that would break her legs if she jumped. She didn't jump. She climbed. On the balcony connected to a narrow decorative ledge that ran along the building's facade, maybe 8 inches wide, barely enough for a foothold. Janet pressed her back against the brick and sidestepped, her bare feet finding purchase on the stone, her fingers gripping the mortar between the bricks. She could hear the man behind her reaching the balcony, cursing, deciding whether to follow. He didn't follow. The ledge was too narrow for someone in tactical gear, but he raised his gun, and the shot hit the brick 6 inches from her head. Stone fragments stung her cheek. She kept moving. 3 more feet, 2. The next balcony. Stephen's, she realized, though she'd never been inside his room, was just within reach. She grabbed the railing, pulled herself over, fell onto the floor of his balcony, gasping, bleeding from a dozen small cuts, her heart hammering so hard she could taste copper. The balcony door opened from inside. Stephen stood there. He had a gun in his hand and blood on his shirt. Not his own, she would learn later, and his face was a landscape of barely controlled fury. He looked at her on the ground, at the blood on her face, at the borrowed nightshirt torn by the brick, and something in his expression went past fury into a place that had no name. "Inside," he said. "Now." She crawled through the doorway. He stepped past her onto the balcony, fired twice, measured, aimed, and the shooter on her balcony dropped. Then Stephen came back inside, closed the door, and for one unguarded moment, before the soldier took over again, he knelt beside her and cupped her face in both hands and looked at her as if he were checking that she was real. "Are you hurt?" His voice was barely above a whisper. His hands were trembling. "I'm okay." She wasn't, but she was alive. "Stephen, they think I'm Celeste. I know. They'll keep coming. I know." His jaw was set. His eyes burned. "They won't get to you. And do you understand me? They will not get to you." He stood, called Victor on the radio, issued orders with the lethal efficiency of a man who had been raised for this. Within 20 minutes, the attack was repelled. 4 of Marchetti's men captured. 2 dead. 1 of Stephen's team injured, not seriously, but enough. Janet tended the wounds. She did it in Stephen's room, which had been converted into a triage area, her hands steady as always, her focus absolute. When she cleaned and sutured and bandaged, and spoke in that calm, warm voice, and not a single person in that room doubted that she belonged there, except her, because belonging there meant something she wasn't ready to face. Afterward, when the house had been secured, and the damaged windows boarded, and the captured men taken away for questioning, Stephen found her in the kitchen. She was sitting at the table, drinking tea that had gone cold, staring at the wall. The adrenaline had worn off. When the trembling had started, he sat across from her, like the night of the storm, like the first time. "It was Luca," he said. He gave them the layout of the house. Janet looked at him. She saw the cost of that sentence in every line of his face. The betrayal compounded. The brother lost again. The wound reopened and deepened. "I'm sorry," she said. "Don't be sorry for me. I should have." He stopped, pressed his palms flat against the table. "I should have anticipated this. I should have moved you sooner. If he'd gotten to you. He didn't. But he could have. But he didn't." She reached across the table and put her hand on his wrist. The first time she had touched him voluntarily. His skin was warm. His pulse was fast. He looked at her hand. Then, at her face. "I climbed along a ledge 3 stories up in my bare feet," she said. "I threw a lamp at a man with a gun. I'm not helpless, Stephen. Stop acting like I am." The ghost of that smile, the one she'd seen in the garden, flickered across his face. "You threw a lamp at him? Brass, antique, probably worth more than my car. I'll buy another one." She almost laughed. It surprised her. The laughter, here, now, in a kitchen that smelled of gun oil and antiseptic. But it was real, and he heard it. And something in his expression shifted from guilt to gratitude. "We need to move," he said. "This location is compromised. I have a place outside the city, a house on the lake. It's more secure and Luca doesn't know about it." "Okay." He blinked. "You're not going to argue? Would it matter if I did?" "It would matter to me." She looked at him, at this man who killed with precision and worried about her opinion, and felt the last wall between them develop a crack that went all the way through. "I'm not arguing," she said, "because for the first time, I actually believe you're trying to keep me alive. Not control me, not own me, keep me alive. I've been trying to tell you that since the first night. I know. But I had to see it for myself." They left at dawn, a convoy of 3 vehicles. Janet in the middle car with Stephen and Victor, driving north along the lakeshore as the sun turned the water to hammered gold. She watched the city recede in the side mirror and thought, "I was supposed to be afraid. I was supposed to want to run." Instead, she was riding toward an unknown house, and with an unknown future, beside a man she had not chosen, but was beginning, against every rational instinct, to trust. And trust, she was learning, was far more terrifying than fear. The house on the lake was nothing like the brownstone, where the Lincoln Park residence had been a fortress disguised as elegance. The lake house was something else entirely, a sprawling timber-frame structure set on a wooded bluff overlooking Lake Michigan, and with floor-to-ceiling windows that turned every room into a frame for the water. It felt, Janet thought as she stepped through the front door, like a place someone had built not for power, but for peace. "My mother designed it," Stephen said, reading her expression. "Before she died, she wanted somewhere that felt far from the city. Somewhere she could hear herself think, 'It's beautiful.' She would have liked hearing you say that." They settled in. The rhythms were different here. Slower, wider, more open. The security team was reduced to a core 4. Victor, Marcus, and 2 others she hadn't met before. Margaret had stayed behind to manage the brownstone repairs, and her absence left a gap in the household that Janet felt more than she expected. But the lake house offered something the brownstone couldn't: space. Physical, emotional, psychological space. The property ran to the waterline, bounded by dense forest on 3 sides. And Janet could walk for an hour without seeing a fence or a wall. She walked every morning, alone, a concession she'd negotiated with Victor, who had protested loudly and then relented when Stephen overruled him. She walked along the bluff, through the birch trees, down to the narrow beach, where the waves left lines of foam on the gray sand. She breathed air that tasted of pine and cold water, and she felt something she hadn't felt in weeks. The beginning of clarity. She was falling in love with Stephen Knapp. She said it to herself clearly, deliberately, the way she might say a diagnosis aloud. The first step in treating a condition is naming it. She was falling in love with him. Not because he'd saved her, or caged her, or given her beautiful rooms and pressed magnolia petals. Because of who he was when no one was performing. Because of the dirt under his fingernails from the garden. Because of the book dedications from his mother. And because he wrote down Mrs. Delgado's insulin schedule on a legal pad. Because he told her he wouldn't ask her to stay and meant it. And the effort of meaning it was written in every careful distance he kept. She was falling in love with him, and she had no idea what to do about it. The days at the lake house were the closest thing to normal either of them had experienced. Stephen cooked. This was a revelation. Not that he could cook. But that cooking was the one activity that stripped him entirely of his control. He became focused, almost playful, tasting sauces with a spoon and adjusting seasonings with a chemist's precision, and occasionally, when he thought no one was watching, humming under his breath. Janet watched him make risotto one evening, stirring the rice with a wooden spoon, adding broth a ladle at a time, and she thought, this is the version of himself he was before all of it. Before the empire, the violence, in the calculus of power. This was the boy his mother had known. You're staring, he said without looking up. I'm observing. There's a difference. Is there? Staring is passive, observing is diagnostic. He did look up then, and his eyes were warm in a way she'd thought he wasn't capable of, and she felt the floor shift under her feet. And what's your diagnosis? He asked. You're a good person, trapped in an impossible life. You're lonely in a way that is calcified into identity. You're the most dangerous man I've ever met, and also the most careful, and I want to know what you look like when you're happy. Your risotto needs more parmesan, she said. He laughed, actually laughed, a short, surprised sound, like a door opening in a wall she'd thought was solid. It changed his face entirely. Took years off, stripped the armor, left something human and warm and achingly real. More parmesan, he repeated. I'm shaking his head. Noted. They ate dinner together that night, and the next night, and the one after that. They talked, really talked. The kind of conversations that start at one shore and end up somewhere entirely unexpected. He told her about his years at Columbia, studying economics before his father's death pulled him back. She told him about nursing school. It's about the professor who'd told her she was too emotional for medicine, and the patient who'd proved him wrong by asking for her specifically, every time, because she was the only one who remembered his name. He told her about his mother, Elena, a pianist who'd married the wrong man and spent 20 years softening his edges before the cancer took her. She told him about the foster home in Evanston, the one with the piano in the living room, and where she'd learned to play chopsticks before being moved again. Oh, they discovered shared territories, a love of Dostoevsky, a weakness for terrible action movies, a belief that coffee was better black, and that silence between two people was not absence, but presence. And they did not touch, not once, not a hand on a shoulder, not a brush of fingers, not the accidental collision of two people sharing a kitchen. Stephen was meticulous about it. He maintained the distance with the discipline of a man defusing a bomb, aware that one wrong move would change everything. Janet noticed. She noticed and understood and was infuriated and grateful in equal measure, because what he was doing, what it cost him every day to be near her and not reach for her, was the most profound act of respect she had ever experienced. He was giving her the one thing no one had ever given her, the absolute certainty that when the time came, and the choice would be hers. On the 33rd day, Victor walked into the kitchen at breakfast with a folder and the expression of a man delivering a eulogy. We found her, he said. Stephen set down his coffee. Janet, who was slicing fruit at the counter, went still. Celeste Marchetti, Victor continued. She's been in Buenos Aires for the past 6 weeks, living under a false name, selling her father's information to a South American cartel. And she has no intention of returning to the States. The room was silent. Then the people looking for her, Janet began. Can be informed, Victor said. Once Marchetti's people confirm she's in Argentina and not Chicago, there's no reason for them to be looking for someone matching her description here. The threat to Miss Wren drops to near zero. Near zero. Not zero. But close. Janet felt the ground shift under her feet. She'd been preparing for this moment, had known it would come. Maude had told herself she'd feel relief, joy, the exhilaration of freedom returned. Instead, she felt the particular vertigo of a trapeze artist who's been told the net has been removed. Stephen's face was unreadable. He looked at Victor. How long to confirm and disseminate? 48 hours. Maybe 72. Do it. Victor left. The kitchen was very quiet. The sound of waves through the open window, the hum of the refrigerator, the distance between two people sitting 10 feet apart, while feeling the width of an ocean. So, Janet said. Her voice was steady, her hands were not. So, Stephen said, I can go home. Yes. In 48 to 72 hours. Yes. She waited for him to say something else, to break the promise he'd made on the balcony. To ask her to stay, or suggest she stay, or create a reason for her to stay. She waited for the manipulation, the guilt, the strings, all the things she'd been trained by life to expect from people who had power over her. And he said nothing. He picked up his coffee, took a sip, set it down, and looked at her with an expression so carefully controlled that she could see the effort it took, could see the discipline holding back everything beneath it. And she understood, with a clarity that felt like light, that his silence was the loudest thing he'd ever said. He was keeping his promise. He was letting her go. The next 48 hours were the longest of Janet's life. Then she packed her things, the few she had, the borrowed clothes, the books she'd been reading, the pressed magnolia petals she'd kept in the pages of the Mary Oliver collection. She organized the medical supplies she'd restocked in the lake house, labeled everything, left notes for the staff about Tomas's follow-up care. She went through the motions of leaving, and every motion felt like tearing adhesive from skin. Stephen was absent. Not physically. He was in the house, in meetings, on calls, but he had retreated behind his walls with a completeness that left her feeling cold. The warmth of the kitchen conversations, the almost laughter over risotto, the slow revealing of selves, all of it had been sealed away, filed under a heading she could almost read. Things that cannot continue. On the second night, she found him on the dock. The lake was black. The sky was packed with stars, more than she'd ever seen from the city, a dizzying abundance of light. And he was sitting at the end of the dock, his legs hanging over the edge, his shoes beside him. Barefoot. She'd never seen him barefoot. Can I sit? She asked. It's your dock as much as mine. That's factually incorrect. Sit down, Janet. She sat. The wood was cool and slightly damp. The water lapped against the pilings in a rhythm that sounded like breathing. I've been thinking, she said. So have I. Can I go first? Please. She looked at the stars, at the water, at the dark line of the forest, at everywhere but him, because if she looked at him, she wasn't sure she could say what needed to be said. I spent my entire life being moved. From home to home, from school to school. Nobody ever asked me if I wanted to stay. Nobody ever gave me the option. I was placed and displaced and replaced, and I learned that the safest thing was to never attach to anything, because attachment meant loss. She paused. The water breathed. And then you took me, Ken, and I was moved again, without my consent, without my choice, into a world I didn't ask for. And I was furious. I am still furious, because you took the one thing I'd built for myself, my life, my job, my independence, and you made the decision for me. I know, he said. His voice was rough. But, she took a breath. But you also did something no one else has ever done. You showed me what it looks like when someone keeps their word. You promised you wouldn't ask me to stay. Yeah, and you haven't. And you won't. And that, her voice cracked, she let it. That is the first time in my life that someone has given me a real choice. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of the lake, the stars, the distance between them, the distance they'd crossed. I don't know what I'm going to do, Janet said. I'm telling you that honestly. I don't know if I'm going to walk out of here and go back to my apartment, and my clinic, and my life, or if... She stopped. It swallowed. I don't know. But I need you to know that whatever I decide, it won't be because you made me. It will be because I chose. Stephen was quiet for a long time. The stars turned overhead. A fish broke the surface somewhere in the dark, a soft sound, barely there. When I was 22, he said, my mother was dying. She was in the hospital, not the free clinic on Halstead, but the same kind of place, understaffed, overwhelmed. And there was a nurse, a young woman. I'm probably not much older than you are now, who sat with her when no one else would. For hours. Through the night, she held my mother's hand and told her that she wasn't alone. And when my mother died at 4 a.m, that nurse was the one who closed her eyes. Janet felt tears she hadn't permitted building behind her eyes. I never got her name, Stephen said. I looked for her afterward, but she'd transferred, gone. And I always thought, that the world is held together by people like that. People who stay. People who show up. People who do the thankless, invisible work of caring. He turned to her, and in the starlight, his eyes were not gray, but silver, alive with something she'd never seen in them before. You are that kind of person, Janet. You have been that kind of person every single day you've been in my house. And I need you to know. He stopped. The discipline wavered. And the wall cracked. I need you to know that, regardless of what you decide, meeting you is the most important thing that has happened to me. Not the most convenient. Not the most strategic. The most important. A tear slipped down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. Thank you, she whispered. Don't thank me for telling the truth. They sat on the dock until the stars began to fade, and the sky turned the pale blue of early morning. They didn't touch. They didn't need to. In some silences are louder than words. This one said everything. The confirmation came at 11:47 a.m. on a Tuesday. Victor delivered the news with his usual economy. Marchetti's organization had verified Celeste's location in Buenos Aires. The search for her in the United States had been called off. The threat to Janet Wren, mistaken identity of a woman she'd never met, was effectively over. Your apartment has been cleaned and secured, Victor added, was speaking to Janet directly for the first time in days. Your car has been serviced. Your position at the clinic is waiting for you. They were told your family emergency has resolved. A pause, almost imperceptible. A car can take you home whenever you're ready. Whenever you're ready. 3 words. A universe of wait. Janet stood in the lake house kitchen, in borrowed clothes, with a pressed flower in her pocket, and felt the full force of a freedom she'd begged for, fought for. It demanded from the moment she'd been dragged from a parking garage 35 days ago. The door was open. She could walk through it, back to her studio apartment, and her clanking radiator, and her 12-hour shifts, and her library card, and her life, small, self-made, entirely hers. The life she'd built from nothing, with no one's help, brick by stubborn brick. Stephen was not in the kitchen. He was in his office, Victor had said. Working, giving her space. Of course he was. Janet went to her room. She changed into her own clothes, the ones Margaret had washed and returned weeks ago, folded neatly, smelling of lavender. The scrubs. The sneakers with the worn soles. She looked at herself in the mirror and saw someone who was the same, but not the same. The face was hers, but the eyes held something new, a depth, a complexity, a layer of experience that hadn't been there 35 days ago. She packed the few things that were hers, left the borrowed clothes folded on the bed, She walked downstairs, through the hallway, past the kitchen, past the sitting room, where she'd read 100 pages of Middlemarch and left poetry books open on desks. Past the door to the garden where Marcus had taught her to identify cedar waxwings and red-tailed hawks. She stopped at Stephen's office door. She knocked. "Come in." He was standing by the window looking at the lake, not working, just standing. When he turned to face her, she saw that he'd known this moment was coming and had been preparing for it the way he'd prepared for everything. Strategically, completely, with every defense in place. His face was composed. His eyes were not. "I'm ready," she said. "The car is out front. Marcus will drive you." "Marcus is a good man." "He is." Silence. The lake glittered behind him. A boat moved in the distance, slow and small, against the vastness. "I won't say goodbye," Stephen said. "I don't believe in them." "What do you believe in?" The question hung in the air. He looked at her. One last time, she thought. One final look from those gray eyes that had seen her, truly seen her, from the very first moment in that basement, and said, "I believe in people who choose to stay." Janet felt the words land in her chest like stones in water, heavy, true, sinking into a place she'd never be able to retrieve them from. She nodded, turned, walked to the front door. Marcus was there, keys in hand, the car running. Victor was there too, arms folded, his expression something she'd never seen on him before. Sadness. Actual, unguarded sadness. "Take care of yourself, miss," Victor said. "Take care of him," she replied. Something passed between them. An understanding, a transfer of responsibility that Victor received with a nod. Janet walked to the car, opened the door, stood there for a moment with one hand on the frame and looking at the lake house, at the timber and glass and the garden she'd walked, at the windows that held the light of a life she hadn't expected and wasn't sure she deserved. She thought about Sophie Reed, the waitress in Milwaukee who hadn't survived being the wrong woman. She thought about Tomas and his 4-year-old daughter. She thought about Margaret's kindness and Marcus's birds and Victor's grudging respect. She thought about risotto and thunderstorms and the way a voice sounds at 2 a.m. when all the masks are down. She thought about a man standing at a window, watching the lake, keeping a promise that was destroying him because he'd decided her freedom mattered more than his heart. And then she thought about herself, about who she was and what she wanted, and what it meant to choose. She'd spent 21 years being moved, placed, and displaced, and replaced, never once, in all those years, had anyone given her a door and said, "This is yours to walk through or not, and either way, I will still be standing here when you decide." Janet closed the car door from the outside. Marcus blinked. "Miss Wren, I need to go back inside." "Is everything—" "Everything is fine, Marcus." She was already walking. "I just forgot something." She walked back through the front door, past Victor, who looked at her with an expression that might, under different circumstances, he'd have been called a grin. Through the hallway, to the office. She didn't knock this time. Stephen was still at the window. He hadn't moved. His hands were at his sides, and his jaw was tight, and she could see that he was holding himself together through sheer force of will. "Janet," he said, and her name in his mouth sounded like a prayer and a wound. "What are you—" "I'm not staying because I'm afraid," she said. "I'm not staying because I have nowhere else to go. No, I'm not staying because you kept me safe, or because you paid my rent, or because you wrote down Mrs. Delgado's insulin schedule on a legal pad." He stared at her. "I'm staying because I choose to. Because for the first time in my life, I have a door I can walk through, and I'm choosing not to. Not because the door's locked, because what's on this side of it is worth staying for." The room was very still. The lake light moved across the walls. "You can't—" His voice broke. Stephen Knapp, who had never broken in front of anyone, broke. "You can't stay here. This life, what I am, the things I've done. I know what you are. I've known for weeks. I've also seen who you are when no one is watching, and those are not the same thing. Janet, I'm not finished." She took a step closer, then another. "I don't need you to be good. I don't need you to be safe. I need you to be honest, and you have been. Painfully, consistently, infuriatingly honest, since the night you looked at me in that basement and told me you knew I wasn't Celeste. She was close enough now to see the gray of his eyes shift, from steel to water, from winter to something warmer, something alive with a light she'd never seen. I choose this, she said. I choose you, not as a captor, not as a protector, as the man who sat in the dark during a thunderstorm and told me his brother broke his heart. Hey, as the man who makes risotto with a wooden spoon and hums when he thinks no one's listening, as the man who kept a promise that cost him everything. Stephen stood perfectly still. A muscle in his jaw worked. His eyes were bright, too bright, dangerously bright. You're certain, he said, not a question, a need. I've never been more certain of anything in my life. He reached out, slowly, carefully, as if she were made of something that might dissolve. He took her hand, not possessively, not desperately. Gently. The way you hold something precious that you've been given permission to touch. His fingers closed around hers, and the warmth of it, the simple, staggering warmth, undid something in both of them. I didn't claim you because you were mine, he said quietly. I claimed you because no one else could protect you the way I could. But now, he looked at their joined hands. Now I'm not claiming anything. I'm asking. Asking what? Will you let me earn this? Not today. Not all at once. But over time. Will you let me show you that this, whatever this is real? Janet looked at him. At this man who had taken her and kept her and infuriated her and seen her more clearly than anyone ever had. This man who had promised her freedom and delivered it and was now standing in the wreckage of his own discipline, asking for permission to love her. Yes, she said, and he pulled her close, not into a kiss, not yet, but into an embrace. Arms around her, on her face against his chest. The steady beat of his heart against her ear. She could feel the tension leave his body in waves, feel the wall he'd built disassemble itself one brick at a time, feel the exhale of a man who had been holding his breath for 35 days. They stood like that in the office, in the lake light, for a long time. Not captor and captive. Not protector and protected. Two people who had found each other in the worst possible way and chosen, in against all odds and reason, to stay. 6 months later, the gala was held in a hotel downtown, one of those places with marble floors and crystal chandeliers and the kind of silence that costs $10,000 a plate. It was a charity event technically, funding for community health clinics on the South Side, a project that had been quietly funded by CANAP money for years, but was now, for the first time, being acknowledged publicly. Janet stood in the lobby and adjusted the collar of her dress, midnight blue, simple, elegant. Margaret had helped her choose it. Victor had inspected it for structural integrity, which Janet suspected was his way of expressing approval. She'd spent the afternoon at the clinic. Back on the floor, back with her patients, back in the life she'd built. Mrs. Delgado's A1C was down to 7.8. Jalen was 6 months clean and had started community college. On the night shift had a new nurse, a young man named Daniel, who reminded Janet of herself 3 years ago, before the parking garage and the basement and the magnolia tree. She was still a nurse. She would always be a nurse. That was the part of herself she'd refused to surrender, the non-negotiable core. Stephen hadn't asked her to. He'd built a clinic annex at the lake house, fully stocked, with a standing offer for any staff member or their family to be treated there. And he'd done it without telling her, and she'd found it one morning and stood in the doorway and cried, not because it was grand or expensive, but because he'd understood. He'd understood that she needed to be needed, that her work was not something she did, but something she was, and he'd made space for it, not as an accommodation, but as an honor. They'd spent 6 months learning each other, not the curated versions, not the captor and the captive. Not the crime lord and the nurse, but the real, unglamorous, complicated truths. She'd learned that he had nightmares about his brother, that he couldn't cook eggs without burning them, despite his skill with everything else. that he read poetry in the bathtub and would deny it if confronted, that his loyalty once given was absolute, and that the weight of that absoluteness sometimes bent him almost to breaking. He'd learned that she flinched at raised voices, not because she was fragile, but because the sound was layered with old meanings, that she kept a box of letters she'd written to Terence, her foster brother, and never sent, that she could sleep through a thunderstorm, but not through silence, that too much quiet made her feel like she was falling, that she was braver than anyone he'd ever met, and that her bravery was not the absence of fear, but the disciplined, daily choice to move forward anyway. They'd argued, they'd argued, and about his methods, about her stubbornness, about the ethics of his empire and the limits of her idealism. She'd told him his world was built on suffering. He'd told her the world was built on suffering regardless, and at least, in his version, someone was managing it. They hadn't resolved it. They wouldn't. Some tensions are not meant to be resolved but held. Two truths in the same hand, heavy and real and irreconcilable. But they'd also built something in the kitchen, and over risotto and burned eggs and coffee that was always black. On the dock, under stars that neither of them had names for. In the quiet hours of early morning, when the masks were down and the only language left was the language of two people choosing, again and again, to stay. The ballroom was full. Donors, politicians, business leaders. The kind of crowd that moved in the orbit of power and pretended not to notice its gravitational pull. Stephen moved through it with the ease of a man who had learned to inhabit rooms like this before he'd learned to inhabit himself. He saw her across the room, standing near the windows, talking to someone, a doctor from the clinic, someone she'd worked with. She was laughing. That laugh, the one that had surprised her in the kitchen that night, the one that had cracked the glacier, was fuller now. Freer. A sound that belonged to a woman who had stopped waiting for the next displacement. And he crossed the room. The crowd parted. They always did. But he wasn't thinking about the crowd. He was thinking about a woman in scrubs on a basement floor who'd looked him in the eye and told the truth. "Janet," he said. She turned, smiled. Not a performance, a real, private smile. The kind that lived behind the ribs. "There you are," she said. He extended his hand. She took it. Yeah, and in front of every person in that room, every donor and politician and rival and ally, Stephen Knapp turned to the woman beside him and said, "This is Janet Wren. She is not my possession. She is not my captive. She is not mine at all." The room listened. "She is the person who chose to stay," he said. "And I am the man who will spend the rest of his life making that choice worth it." Janet felt the weight of every eye in the room and didn't flinch. And she'd stood on a ledge 3 stories up in the dark. She'd thrown a brass lamp at a man with a gun. She'd walked through a door and turned around and walked back, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. She squeezed his hand. "And I," she said, her voice steady and sure and entirely her own, "am the woman who doesn't need a cage to know where she belongs." The room was quiet. Then it wasn't. Later they would dance, not formally. Stephen Knapp was not, it turned out, a good dancer, and the discovery delighted Janet in a way that would become a running joke between them for years. They would step on each other's feet and laugh and hold each other close, and the chandeliers would cast light across their faces like small, scattered constellations. But that would come later. In this moment, in the quiet, after the words, and before the applause, they stood together, hand in hand, equal, chosen, and the silence between them said what it had always said. From the very beginning. You are not who I was looking for. You are who I found. And I would find you again. In every version of this life. In every basement. In every storm, I would find you, and I would choose you, and I would stay. Always, I would stay.